Have you ever noticed how heavy a thought can be? It weighs nothing on a scale, yet it can feel like you are carrying a mountain on your shoulders. It keeps you awake. It keeps you tight. It keeps you from the peace you deserve. I'm glad you're here. If you are listening to this, it's likely that your day has been long, or your mind is busy. Perhaps you are replaying conversations, worrying about tomorrow, or simply feeling a tension you can't quite name. That is okay. You don't need to force it to stop. And if you feel like it, you can gently let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Sometimes, it's comforting to realize how many of us are quietly sharing this same moment from different corners of the world. You see, the mind is like a guardian dog. It barks at shadows because it wants to protect you. We don't need to yell at the dog to be quiet. We just need to gently let it know that we are safe, so it can lay its head down and rest. For the next hour, I am going to share a collection of stories with you. These aren't just fairy tales. They are mirrors. Some are from the Zen tradition, some from Stoic philosophy, and some are simple metaphors for the human experience. Each story revolves around two things: the art of letting go and the discovery of your inner strength. You don't need to memorize these stories. You don't even need to listen to every word. If you drift off to sleep in the middle of a sentence, that is perfect. That is the goal. Think of my voice as a gentle breeze. You can enjoy it while it's there, but you don't need to hold on to it. Get comfortable now. Adjust your pillows. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Let's begin with our first journey, a journey about the weight we choose to carry. Some doors don't need to be locked from the outside. They close very softly, almost without a sound. And then we get so used to being inside that we forget we ever had the key. Ben was 31, working in startups, living alone in an apartment that was darker than it needed to be. Not because he liked the dark, but because bright light made his thoughts feel louder. That evening, he sat on the sofa with only a small lamp turned on near the wall. The warm yellow light reached the ceiling enough to give the room shape, but not enough to demand his attention. Ben's phone rested in his hand. The screen lit up, then went dark. Lit up, then dark again. Old notifications, messages he hadn't replied to, emails he had read but never reopened. He didn't act on any of them. He just held the phone like holding a thread that connected him to a place he didn't want to return to. There was someone Ben hadn't forgiven. Not because that person hadn't apologized. The apology had come long ago. Short, clear, no excuses. But inside Ben, the door stayed closed. Not to punish anyone, only because he was afraid that if he opened it, everything would rush in at once. He had thought about it many times. About keeping distance. About protecting himself. And in a way, he had succeeded too well. So well that there was no one else left in that space with him. Ben set the phone down on the table, then picked it up again. He had done this for many evenings in a row, as if holding it meant he was still in control of the story. But every time the screen went dark, the room felt larger and the silence more noticeable. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city was still moving. Car lights stretched into long lines. No one knew he was standing there. No one was waiting for him to respond. The thought felt both relieving and sad. Ben remembered the first time he decided to close the door. There was no ritual, no announcement, just an evening much like this one, when he felt too tired to keep explaining, too tired to keep hoping. And so he closed it slowly, firmly. At first it felt like safety, like being in a room where no one could interrupt. But over time, the room stayed the same while he changed. The air grew heavier. The distance between him and the world stretched longer. Ben returned to the sofa and sat down. He unlocked the phone, looked at the screen, then locked it again. A small click echoed in the quiet. The sound made him pause, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. Familiar enough that he'd never really noticed it before. He tried something very small. He didn't open an app. He didn't read a message. He simply placed the phone face down on the table, so the screen could no longer look at him. A sense of emptiness appeared right away, like closing a side door and suddenly realizing how quiet the main room is. Ben rested his hands on his thighs. His shoulders were tight. He let them drop slightly, not to relax, just because they were tired. In that moment, he noticed something that surprised him. This door might never have been locked from the outside at all. No one was standing guard. No one was holding the key. There was only him sitting here, used to staying inside. The thought didn't make him jump up and open the door right away. It simply created a small opening, just enough to let the space feel less suffocating. Ben leaned back into the sofa. The yellow light was the same. The room was the same. But the feeling of being trapped wasn't as solid as before. It shifted into a quiet question: if I open the door, what's the worst that could happen? He didn't answer the question. He didn't need to. Tonight wasn't the time to decide. It was enough to know that the door wasn't a wall, and that the thickest walls are sometimes built from habit alone. Ben closed his eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to stop seeing the door. When he opened them again, the room hadn't changed. But the tightness in his chest had eased just a little. And that alone was enough to make this evening feel less like a sealed prison than it had before. Ben stayed seated on the sofa a little longer. There was no urge to do anything next. Without the phone clenched in his hand, his palms rested empty on his thighs. But the emptiness wasn't as uncomfortable as he'd imagined. It felt like taking off a heavy jacket and realizing the room temperature is just right. He stood and walked into the kitchen. He didn't turn on the overhead light, letting the glow from the living room spill in instead. Ben poured himself a glass of water and took small sips. The coolness slid down his throat, waking his body slightly, but in a gentle way. He didn't need more caffeine. Tonight he didn't need to stay alert, guarding anything. When he returned to the living room, Ben noticed the door to the balcony. It was closed but not locked. He looked at the handle for a moment. He didn't step closer. He didn't try to open it. He just looked. And for the first time in months, the thought "I'm stuck" didn't arrive with that image. He remembered the early days after the inner door had closed. Back then he believed he was protecting a wound. And maybe he was. But over time the wound had changed. It no longer needed the same level of guarding. He just hadn't updated the way he was living with it. Ben went back to the sofa and sat down again. His back settled into the cushion legs stretched out. This wasn't a defensive posture. It was the posture of someone resting. His breath moved in and out steady. No counting, no adjusting. Nothing here was threatening him. He thought of the other person briefly. No clear image, no specific words, just a faint presence. He realized he didn't need to decide about forgiveness right now. He only needed to stop imprisoning himself inside an undecided moment. Some doors don't need to be thrown wide open for us to feel freer. It's enough to know they can open. Enough to stop leaning our weight against them all day long. Ben stood and pulled the curtain back a little. The city outside was still lit. No one noticed whether he opened the curtain or not. A light breeze slipped through the gap, bringing in cool air, a small exchange between inside and out. He went to bed. He didn't bring the phone with him. He didn't bring the old story either. When he lay down, his body responded quickly. The blanket rested over his shoulders. The temperature was just right. Nothing else needed arranging. Ben closed his eyes. He wasn't trying to sleep. He let his eyelids grow heavy with the rhythm of his breath. The door in his mind wasn't fully open, but it wasn't sealed shut anymore. Light wasn't flooding in, but air was moving. If tomorrow he still isn't ready to step outside, that's okay. No one is counting the days he spends in or out. There's no sentence waiting. Some processes don't need speed. They just need the lock to be gone. The room was quiet. No sound of bolts, no click of locks. Just a man who was no longer holding himself as tightly as before, and a body allowed to rest in a space that finally felt wide enough. And in that gentle loosening sleep arrived, without needing to pass through any door at all. Some anger doesn't come from a big event. It comes from telling a small story too many times. Each time we retell it, we throw another dry branch into the fire. The fire doesn't explode on its own. It simply does what the wood allows it to do. Kevin was 37, an accountant used to tidy numbers and workdays that ended on time. But that evening he got home later than usual. Not because of extra work, just a meeting that ran 10 minutes long, followed by a comment that seemed harmless, said right as everyone stood up to leave. Kevin didn't react then. He smiled lightly, nodded, packed his things. Everything stayed polite. But once he got home, kicked off his shoes by the door, the anger began to take clearer shape. Not loud, just hot. He went straight into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Hot water poured over his shoulders, steam quickly fogging the mirror. The space closed in, leaving only the steady sound of water washing out everything else. Kevin stood there with his eyes closed, letting the water hit his back, the usual end-of-day routine. In his mind, the meeting replayed. Every sentence, every look. Kevin thought about what he should have said, how he should have answered, how he should have clarified things right then. Each should was another dry branch tossed into the fire. The flame didn't flare up immediately, but it grew a little hotter. The water kept running. The steam thickened. Kevin pressed a hand against the tiled wall, warm under his palm. He noticed his jaw was clenched. His shoulders were lifted higher than normal. His body was reacting to a conversation that had already ended. He opened his eyes and looked at the blurred mirror. The reflection was vague, just a figure standing still in the steam. And it hit him. The event was over. But in his head, it was still happening. Edited, expanded, repeated. Sometimes we think we're processing anger by thinking it through, but often we're just feeding it. Every branch is dry because it comes from memory. And memory, when pulled out again and again, catches fire easily. Kevin adjusted the shower, letting the water turn slightly cooler. Not much, just enough to feel the difference. The steam began to thin. The fire in his chest didn't grow anymore. It paused, waiting. He tried something else. He didn't keep retelling the story. He didn't argue in his head. He didn't prepare imaginary responses. He just stood there with the water, with his breath, with a body that was heating up, then slowly cooling down. This felt different from holding it in. It felt like not throwing anything else into the fire. For a few seconds, a kind of quiet appeared. Not outside, but inside. Not a big empty space, just a small opening where the anger wasn't being fed. Kevin noticed that without new wood, the fire changed. It was still there, but it wasn't sharp anymore. He turned off the shower and stepped out, wrapping a towel around himself. Cool air touched his skin clearly. Kevin breathed in, then out. Not deep, not long. Just enough to notice his chest wasn't tight anymore. In the mirror, his reflection slowly came back as the steam faded. Nothing special, no look of triumph. Just someone who had stopped in the middle before the fire could spread. Kevin dried his hair and hung the towel on the hook. Familiar motions, steady, thoughtless. In his mind, the meeting story wasn't running anymore. It still existed, but it wasn't being told. Like embers cooling once no one stirs them. He stepped out into the living room. The light was soft. The space was quiet. Kevin sat down and felt his body sink slightly in a comfortable way. Not exhausted, just no longer tense. Some nights, what drains us isn't the first spark of anger. It's all the dry wood we add afterward, believing we're making things clearer. But fire doesn't need clarity. It only needs fuel. Kevin leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. The fire inside him wasn't completely out, but it wasn't being fed anymore. And that alone was enough for the evening to begin to soften. Kevin sat quietly on the sofa. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't pick up his phone. The room was lit only by the soft yellow glow of a lamp in the corner. This space didn't ask him to react, to keep thinking, or to prepare for anything. It simply allowed him to be still. The anger from earlier hadn't disappeared completely. It was still there like glowing embers after the flames have pulled back. But when Kevin didn't stare at it, didn't poke at it, it began to cool on its own. No water needed, no force, just time and quiet. He stood up, went into the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. The sound of water filling the glass was barely audible. Kevin drank in slow sips, feeling his throat soften, sometimes bringing attention back to the body, is the fastest way to stop the mind from spinning. Back on the sofa, Kevin stretched his legs out in front of him. The backrest supported his weight. His shoulders dropped lower than before, his jaw unclenched. Small signs, but his body noticed immediately. It knew when it no longer needed to stay on guard. In Kevin's mind, the meeting from earlier appeared only faintly now. No clear sentences, no chain of imagined replies. When a story isn't repeated, it shortens on its own, like a fire without wood, first dim red, then gray. He realized something very simple. Not every thought needs to be followed all the way through to be considered processed. Some thoughts finish their work the moment we stop feeding them. Kevin walked into the bedroom. No rush, no phone in hand. He turned on a small lamp just enough to see. As he sat on the bed, he felt the difference between now and when he'd first come home. His body felt heavier in a comforting way, no longer tight like a drawn string. He lay down and pulled the blanket up to his shoulders. The temperature was just right. The room was cool and still. Kevin turned onto his side, finding his familiar position. No thought jumped up demanding to be resolved. What remained was only a faint afterglow, like warmth lingering in a kitchen after cooking is done. Some anger doesn't need to be overcome. It just needs to stop being retold. When the story ends, the fire no longer knows where to burn. Kevin closed his eyes. He didn't force himself to sleep. He let his eyelids grow heavy. His breath moved in then out, steady and even. Each breath felt like a small pause between the remaining thoughts. And in those pauses, his body did what it knows how to do. If tomorrow, when he remembers that meeting, the anger rises again just a little, Kevin knows he'll recognize the familiar moment. This is where I'm about to throw in more wood. And just like tonight, he can choose not to. Not because he's weak, but because it isn't necessary. The room slowly settled into silence. No conclusions, no promises. Just a fire no longer being fed and a body returning to its safe, natural state. And in that quiet sleep arrived naturally, like the last embers finally cooling, leaving just enough warmth to keep the night from feeling cold. Some words, when left unsaid, begin to speak inside us again and again. Not to be heard, but to be carried. And sometimes what exhausts us isn't that the other person doesn't understand, but that we've been carrying those unspoken words for far too long. Lila was 55, a volunteer at an end-of-life care center. Her work required quiet presence, listening more than advising. She was used to unfinished sentences, to things left unsaid before time closed in. Maybe that was why that evening when she got home, she felt a familiar pull to write. She turned on the small desk lamp in her study. The soft yellow light fell onto a wooden desk worn smooth at one corner. Lila pulled out the chair, sat down, opened a drawer, and took out a blank sheet of paper. No title, no dear someone, just a wide open space. She held the pen and paused for a few seconds. Her hand didn't shake. She just didn't touch the paper yet. Some things, even when they've been ready inside us for a long time, still need a moment of permission to come out. Then she began to write. Not in order, not carefully polished, Some sentences were short, others long. Some words pressed darker into the page, others faded. Lila wrote about times she'd been misunderstood, moments she'd been overlooked, things she'd swallowed because she believed saying them wouldn't change anything. She wrote about anger that arrived late and quietly, but stayed for a long time. There were no sharp accusations, just truth placed on the page as honestly as she could manage right now. As she wrote, she didn't imagine the other person reading it. That wasn't necessary. This letter was never meant to be sent. With each line, a piece of weight moved out of her chest. It didn't disappear. It shifted. From inside her body onto the paper. And that movement alone made her breathing feel a little easier. She stopped when her hand grew tired, set the pen down, looked at the page filled with words. She didn't reread it from top to bottom. She didn't need to. She had already been inside every sentence while writing it. Reading it again wouldn't add anything. She folded the paper in half, then into quarters. Slow, careful movements. Not because she was afraid of tearing it, but because she was closing a flow. When she set the letter aside, she noticed her hand felt lighter, like she'd just put down something she'd been holding all day. Lila stood and went into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water. Cool, clear. She drank in small sips. Some evenings, the body needs very simple things to remember, that everything is safe. Back in the study, she looked at the letter again. It lay there quietly, not demanding, not urging, not needing a reply. And in that moment, Lila realized something gentle and true. Not every word needs a recipient to have meaning. Some words only need to be spoken so the speaker can finally rest. She picked up the letter and stood in front of the small trash bin beside the desk. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply stood there a little longer, making sure she didn't need to hold on to it anymore. The desk lamp lit the neatly folded paper. Outside, the night was still. Nothing pressed her. No deadline waited. The letter had done its work. Lila didn't burn the letter right away. She placed it back on the desk, turned off the light in her study, and walked slowly into the kitchen. Not because she was hesitating, but because her body needed a few more minutes to catch up with what had just happened. Some forms of letting go happen quickly in the mind, but take a little longer to sink into the body. In the kitchen, she turned on the small gas burner and set an old metal bowl on top. She didn't use a strong flame, just enough heat to warm. The pale blue flame stayed steady, no flaring, no rush. Lila watched it for a moment, as if matching her pace to its rhythm. She went back to the study and picked up the letter again. The paper felt softer now from being folded so many times. There was no sense of regret, only a clear stillness, like when a conversation has reached the point where nothing more needs to be said. Lila tore the letter in half, then into 4 pieces, then 8. Each tear made a very small sound, almost blending into the quiet hiss of the burner. She didn't reread a single word. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Now, it didn't need to keep its shape. She carried the pieces into the kitchen and dropped them one by one into the metal bowl. The paper touched the flame, curled inward, then darkened. There was no large fire, just a soft orange glow spreading slowly enough to change the paper. Lila stood there without interfering. No stirring, no rushing. When the last piece turned to ash, she turned off the stove. The kitchen returned to silence. Inside the bowl was a thin layer of pale gray ash. Words, no sentences, no voice left. Just the trace of something that had finished being said. She let the bowl cool, then carried it outside and poured the ash into a small planter on the balcony. The ash fell into the soil and blended in quickly, leaving no distinct form behind. She didn't think about symbolism. It simply felt right. What had once been heavy could now become something that fed something else. Back inside, Lila turned off all the lights, leaving only a dim glow in the hallway. The familiar space held her gently. She went into the bedroom, changed, and lay down. There was no feeling of mission accomplished, no sense of victory, just the feeling of not having to carry anything anymore. Her breathing slowed and evened out. Her chest no longer felt tight like it had earlier in the evening. There were no sentences in her mind waiting to be written, no responses being prepared. A kind of emptiness appeared, but it wasn't cold. It felt like a room that had just been cleaned, carrying the faintest trace of freshness. Lila thought of the people she met through her work. People who had carried so many unsaid words until there was no longer time to speak them. And she realized that tonight she had given herself a very quiet gift, saying what could be said while there was still time so she wouldn't have to carry it any further. If old memories return tomorrow, that's okay. They can knock. But the door is no longer locked from the inside. Not because everything has been fully forgiven, but because she's no longer keeping herself trapped in the same room with them. Lila turned onto her side and pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. The room was just dark enough. No sudden sounds, no thoughts needing attention. What remained was only the lightest sensation of a body that had finally set down an invisible weight. The unsent letter had completed its purpose. It didn't need a recipient. It didn't need a reply. It only needed to be written and then allowed to dissolve. And in that dissolving, the night opened wide. Sleep arrived not as an ending, but as a deep pause when there were no more words left to hold. The mirror didn't break loudly. Grace noticed it the next morning when the light from the porch hit the glass at an angle it didn't usually reach. A thin line ran across the corner, quiet and pale, like something that had happened while no one was watching. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, holding her coffee, letting the kettle click off behind her. She didn't remember dropping it. She didn't remember a sound in the night. Just this line now here. Grace was 62, retired, the kind of person who noticed small things because life had finally slowed down enough to make room for them. She set the mug down, touched the edge of the mirror with one finger, careful not to press. The glass was still smooth. The crack didn't cut. It just interrupted. Later that evening, she carried the mirror out to the porch. The swing creaked gently as she sat down, the same sound it had made for years, steady and familiar. Crickets were already starting up in the yard. She rested the mirror against her knees, tilted slightly, catching the dim gold of the porch light. There had been a time when Grace would have thrown it out right away. Broken meant done. Replace it. Move on. But she didn't feel rushed tonight. She took a cloth from her pocket and wiped the surface slowly, not trying to fix anything, just clearing the dust. Her reflection fractured as she moved her face, appearing in pieces that didn't quite line up. It was strange how even a small break could change the whole image. Grace thought about how anger works the same way. It doesn't always come in shouting or slam doors. Sometimes it settles in quietly. It waits. It turns into distance, into silence, into the way you stop expecting anything good from someone without ever saying so out loud. She had been carrying that kind of anger for a long time. Not the explosive kind, the tidy kind. The kind you keep folded neatly, like a letter you never sent. Years ago, someone close to her had said something that couldn't be taken back. It wasn't dramatic. No betrayal, no shouting. Just a sentence that landed wrong and stayed there. A comment that made her feel small in a moment when she had trusted enough to be open. Grace never confronted it. She told herself it wasn't worth it, that she was being mature, reasonable. But the anger didn't disappear. It just hardened into something quieter. She adjusted the mirror on her lap. The crack caught the light again, more visible now. She wondered how many times she had replayed that moment in her head over the years, polishing it, turning it, letting it reflect different versions of the same hurt. Forgiveness had always sounded to her like pretending the crack wasn't there, like forcing the glass back into a shape it no longer had. She wasn't interested in that. The porch was cool now. A breeze moved through the trees, lifting the leaves just enough to make them whisper. Grace rested her hands on the frame of the mirror and let her shoulders drop. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to notice the weight she'd been holding. There's something exhausting about anger that doesn't get expressed. It stays active. It keeps checking the past, like it might change if you look at it one more time. It sharpens your memory. It edits your expectations. It makes the world feel a little harder than it needs to be. Grace hadn't realized how much of her energy had been leaking into that old moment until now, sitting here watching her reflections split and rejoin with every shift of light. She thought about what it would mean to fix the mirror. Not to make it invisible, not to erase the crack, but to let it exist differently. Years ago, she had seen a documentary about a Japanese art form, kintsugi, broken pottery repaired with gold. The cracks weren't hidden. They were traced, honored. The object wasn't restored to what it was before. It became something else, more honest, more deliberate. Grace smiled a little at the thought, not because it solved anything, just because it felt truer than the idea of going back to normal. She wasn't ready to forgive the way people usually talk about forgiveness. She didn't feel warm or generous. She didn't feel like reaching out. What she felt was tired. Tired of holding something sharp so carefully. She set the mirror down beside the swing and leaned back, letting it sway slightly. The rope creaked again. The sound filled the quiet in a way that didn't demand attention. For the first time in a long while, Grace considered this. Maybe forgiveness isn't about the other person at all. Maybe it's about changing how you carry what happened. The mirror, broken and still useful, waited beside her. It wasn't asking to be fixed tonight. It wasn't asking for a decision. It was just there. And for now, that was enough. Grace didn't try to repair the mirror that night. She left it leaning against the porch wall just inside the circle of light. Before going back into the house, she paused and looked at it once more. The crack was still there, clear and honest. Nothing had changed, and yet something had loosened. Inside the house felt quieter than usual. Not silent, just unburdened. Grace moved through the rooms without turning on extra lights. The familiar sounds followed her: the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the hallway clock. Ordinary sounds, anchoring sounds. When she washed her hands at the sink, she noticed how warm the water felt against her skin. She let it run a second longer than necessary, watching it slip through her fingers and disappear down the drain. There was no rush to finish, no thought she needed to catch. Anger often convinces us that it's doing something useful, that it's protecting us, that if we keep it close, we won't be hurt again. But standing there, hands wet, shoulders relaxed, Grace could feel how heavy that protection had been, how much effort it took to keep it intact. She dried her hands, slowly folded the towel neatly, and set it back where it belonged. Small motions done without commentary. Her body seemed to know what to do before her mind tried to explain it. Later, lying in bed, Grace stared at the ceiling fan as it turned at its lowest setting. The air moved gently across her face. She didn't replay the old conversation tonight. She didn't rehearse a response she'd never send. The memory still existed somewhere inside her, but it no longer demanded center stage. That surprised her. Forgiveness, she realized, might not arrive as a decision. It might arrive as a quiet reduction. Less tension in the jaw, less replaying, less heat behind the eyes. Not gone, just less. The broken mirror stayed on the porch for days. Grace passed it every morning, every evening. Sometimes she caught her reflection in it, split by that thin line. Sometimes she didn't look at it at all. One afternoon, she brought out a small box from the hall closet. Inside were odds and ends she'd kept without knowing why: buttons, a loose earring, a tiny vial of gold-colored paint left over from a craft project years ago. She set the box down next to the mirror, then laughed softly at herself. Not today, she thought. There was no urgency to make it beautiful yet. What mattered more was that she had stopped seeing the crack as a failure. It was simply a record of pressure, of impact, of something that had met resistance and not fully broken. Grace rocked gently on the porch swing, eyes half closed. The air had cooled. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, then settled. The world continued without commentary. Anger, when held for too long, keeps the body alert. It tightens muscles. It sharpens the mind. It makes rest feel undeserved. Tonight, rest came without negotiation. Grace didn't forgive anyone in a grand way. She didn't make peace with the past. She didn't rewrite the story. She just stopped gripping it so tightly. And in that small release, something softened. The night felt wider, the air easier to breathe. The broken mirror waited patiently, unchanged. When Grace finally stood up to go inside, she didn't feel the need to bring it with her. It could stay where it was imperfect and whole enough. Some things don't need fixing right away. Some things only need space. As the lights went out and the house settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm, Grace felt her breath slow on its own. No effort, no instruction, just the quiet relief of no longer holding something sharp. The night held everything else. The beach in the late afternoon moved at a different pace. No more loud laughter, no rush from the harsh sun. Just the steady rhythm of the waves and a light breeze carrying the smell of salt. Jason crouched near the water's edge, his hands coated in wet sand. In front of him, a sandcastle was slowly taking shape. Jason was 23, a community college student who had just finished a not-so-great semester. His grades weren't bad enough to panic over, but not good enough to feel settled either. Some nights, he lay awake thinking about the future, the way you think about a math problem with missing information. No matter how hard you try, something always feels incomplete. That afternoon, he came to the beach alone. Not to figure anything out, just to sit somewhere that didn't ask things to last. He scooped up sand, packed it down, stacked small sections one on top of another. The castle wasn't big. It had no ambition, just enough to let him see his effort turn into something visible. Each time a wave pulled back, the wet sand shimmered, reflecting the fading sky. Jason built low walls, smoothing them gently with his fingers. There was a natural focus in those repeated movements. No plan, no optimization, just being there. He thought about the plans he'd made before. Other castles, school goals, career paths, images of a clearer future. Some of them he'd built carefully, piece by piece. And then for one reason or another, they hadn't held the way he'd hoped. They didn't collapse all at once. They just softened, touched by the waves of circumstance. Jason added a small tower to one corner of the castle. It leaned slightly. He adjusted it gently, not trying to make it perfectly straight, just enough for it to stand. Wet sand holds its shape pretty well for a while. The water crept closer. A thin sheet of it brushed the base of the castle, then pulled away. It didn't destroy anything. It just left behind small grooves. Jason watched without lifting the castle higher. He knew the tide was rising on its own schedule. Something became very clear to him in that moment. Building isn't meaningless even when the result doesn't last. The feel of sand in his hands, the focus of placing each piece, the moment of seeing something he made stand even temporarily. All of it was real. Jason leaned back a little, giving the waves more room. He planted his hands behind him, feeling the cool sand under his palms. The air was softer. The sun was lower. No one was rushing him to finish before dark. A familiar fear crossed his mind. If everything I build can be washed away, what's the point of building at all? But the question felt lighter as he looked at the castle. The castle didn't ask to last forever. It only asked to be built with full presence. Jason leaned in again and fixed a small detail near the entrance. Not to make it stronger, just because he felt like it. A very small pleasure with no long-term payoff. No need for recognition. The waves returned, this time a little stronger. One corner wall collapsed slowly. No drama. The sand loosened and dissolved into the water. Jason didn't reach out to save it. He just watched. His chest didn't tighten the way he expected. There was a brief sense of loss, then it passed. Sometimes we think we're afraid of losing things, when what we're really afraid of is the act of holding on. When the grip loosens, that fear has nowhere to stand. Jason stood up and brushed the sand from his pants. He looked at the castle once more. It was still there, even with a corner gone. Enough to see that care had gone into it. Enough to know he had built it honestly. The sky shifted colors. The breeze grew cooler. Jason turned away from the castle and walked along the shoreline. He didn't need to stay for the final moment. He didn't need to make sure of anything. He knew the waves would do their work, and somehow, that knowledge made his steps feel lighter. Jason walked slowly along the shoreline, leaving faint footprints in the wet sand behind him. With each step, the prints stayed visible for a few seconds. Then the waves washed over them, unhurried, not erasing them all at once. He didn't turn around to look. Not because he wanted to forget, but because there was no need to check. The wind softened. The air was cool, carrying the familiar scent of salt and seaweed. Jason let out a long breath, as if his body were gently setting something down. Something it had been holding all day. Not a decision, just the feeling of having to hold on. He sat on a low rock near the water. Waves hit the stone, then pulled back steady and predictable. No two waves were the same, but the rhythm was familiar. Jason rested his hands on his knees, feeling the chill of the wind first, then the warmth returning as his body adjusted. He thought about the sandcastle, not its shape, but the feeling of building it. The weight of wet sand in his hands. The quiet focus of placing each small piece where it belonged. That feeling hadn't been taken by the waves. It was still there, close and intact. Maybe not everything we do needs to stay. Maybe some things only need to pass through our hands, leave a mark inside us, and then be allowed to dissolve. Like waves, like footprints, like plans that were once taken very seriously, but no longer fit who we are now. Jason lifted his gaze to the horizon. The sun hovered just above the water, its light stretched into a thin golden line. Not dramatic, not loud, just there. He didn't take a photo. He didn't try to capture the moment. Some moments are most beautiful when they don't need proof. He noticed he was no longer blaming himself for the castles that had been lost. Not because he'd figured everything out, but because he no longer saw loss as failure. It was simply part of building in a world that's always moving. The waves kept rising and falling. Somewhere behind him, the sandcastle might have collapsed further or disappeared completely. Jason didn't know. And strangely, not knowing didn't bother him. It created a light open space where he didn't have to keep watch. He stood up and brushed the sand from his hands. The sun sank a little lower. The sky deepened into blue. Jason walked toward the parking lot, not fast, not slow. His steps were steady. There was nothing he needed to rush to hold on to before night arrived. On the way back, he thought about the things he still wanted to do. Not big plans, just small things he could start then adjust as he went. Like building another sandcastle someday on a different beach. Not to make it last forever, but to build it again. Sometimes we think letting go means giving up. But maybe letting go is simply allowing ourselves not to carry what has already finished its work. Those things don't disappear. They become sand. They become ground. They become what supports the next steps. Jason stopped and looked at the ocean one last time before leaving. The waves were steady, the breeze cool, nothing especially remarkable. And because of that, the moment was calm enough to set down. He turned away and walked on. Not carrying the castle, only the feeling of having built with care and having let go at the right time. The night took care of the rest. Winter doesn't always arrive with snow. Sometimes it comes as cold wind slipping through your collar, as gray skies that linger for days, as the quiet sense that everything has slowed down without any announcement. Holly stood at the bus stop, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. It was already dark earlier than in other seasons. Streetlights flickered on their pale yellow glow, reflecting off the damp pavement. The wind wasn't strong, but it was enough to let the cold creep into every small opening. Holly was 33, a nursing assistant used to taking care of others. Her shift had ended late, her body tired, her mind empty in that specific way that comes from giving too much of yourself in one day. She stood still, not stamping her feet for warmth, not checking her phone. Just standing there, letting time pass in the cold. The bus stop was quiet. A few people stood spaced apart just far enough. No one spoke. Only the wind and the distant sound of passing cars. Holly breathed out. A thin cloud of vapor appeared, then disappeared almost instantly. She watched it, then let her eyes rest. Some seasons in life feel like a long winter. Not because something is wrong, but because nothing is growing. No clear progress. No sign that warmth is on its way. And what exhausts people most isn't the cold itself, but the fear that it might never end. Holly thought about the past few months. Shift after shift. Coming home after dark, waking up to gray mornings. She wasn't sad in a dramatic way, just quietly worn down like ground that's been frozen for too long. She wrapped her scarf tighter and pulled her sleeves down. A natural reflex. Protection. Warmth. In the cold, the body knows what to do, even when the mind hasn't caught up yet. The bus hadn't arrived. The digital sign blinked, showing a few more minutes. Holly didn't check it again. A few minutes or 10 wouldn't change anything. She stood there listening to her breathing, which grew steadier once she stopped trying to warm herself by constant movement. Someone walked past, leaving behind the faint smell of a damp coat. A car splashed through a puddle, sending up a few drops. The city kept living through its winter, without complaining, without apologizing. Holly remembered past winters. Some had been long, some had felt endless, and yet somehow they had passed. Not in a single day. Not with a dramatic sign. Just one morning when the light felt slightly different, the wind less sharp, and she realized she'd made it through the coldest part. She slipped a hand into her coat pocket and touched her knitted gloves. She didn't put them on yet, just touched them. The softness eased the numbness in her fingers a little. A very small warmth, but real. There are fears that whisper, what if it stays like this forever? What if I've gone too far into winter? But winter doesn't ask for answers. It only asks to be walked through one day at a time. Holly looked up at the sky. No stars, just a deep gray stretch. She didn't search for signs of spring in this night. She didn't need to. Night isn't meant to promise anything. It only needs to be quiet enough to stand within. The bus appeared at the end of the street, its white headlights cutting through the dark. It arrived neither sooner nor later than expected. It arrived when it arrived. Holly stepped on, tapped her card, and found a seat near the window. The seat was cold at first, then slowly warmed. She leaned her head against the glass. Her breath fogged a small patch. Outside, the scenery moved past, slowly blurred. Holly didn't try to see it clearly. She didn't need to know exactly where she was passing, only that she was moving. There's something strange about winter, even when everything looks still. Something is always flowing underneath, like roots beneath frozen soil, like water moving under ice, unseen but never stopped. Holly closed her eyes, not to sleep, just to stop meeting the cold with her gaze. As the bus warmed, her body loosened slightly. Maybe this winter wasn't over yet. Maybe it would last a while longer. But that didn't mean it was all there would ever be. The bus moved on at a steady pace, the low hum of the engine like a large heartbeat, keeping the space from falling too quiet. Holly leaned against the window. Her breath fogged the glass once more, then slowly faded. She didn't wipe it away. She let the mark disappear on its own, the way many things in life do when they aren't held on to. Outside, streetlights passed one by one. Light brushed her face, then slid away, never staying long. Holly didn't count them, didn't track them. She let her eyes rest, letting her body be carried without having to stay alert. As the bus warmed, her shoulders dropped. Not because she decided to relax, but because the cold that had made her hold herself tight at the stop was no longer pressing in the same way. Some kinds of letting go happen naturally when the conditions change. Holly thought of winter as a necessary pause. No one chooses it. No one schedules it. But when it comes, the body adapts, adding layers, slowing down, staying closer to warmth. Maybe the mind needs similar things. Not big solutions, just small adjustments that make it possible to get through. She remembered a morning from years ago when winter had just begun to turn into spring. There hadn't been dramatic melting, just a shift in light. Windows that felt less cold to the touch. And she had known, without needing proof, that the hardest part was behind her. The bus turned onto a familiar street. Holly opened her eyes and looked out. Low houses, windows glowing. Somewhere someone was cooking dinner. Someone else was sitting quietly after a long day. Each home held its own rhythm. No need to match another. She slipped a hand into her pocket, touched her gloves again, then pulled them out and put them on. This time it wasn't because she was too cold. It was because she wanted the warmth more clearly. A small choice, but enough. The fear that winter might never end was no longer standing right in front of her. It hadn't disappeared, but it had stepped back. Winter might still be here, but it wasn't the whole picture. The bus stopped. Holly stood and stepped down. The air outside was colder than inside the bus, but it didn't shock her the way it had earlier. Her body had adjusted. She pulled her scarf up and walked slowly toward home. The porch light turned on as she approached. A small circle of light opened in the darkness. Holly paused for a moment, breathing in, then out. This breath wasn't rushed. It didn't need to be. Some seasons don't ask us to be strong. They only ask us to keep going, to stay warm enough, not to go numb, and to trust that the light will change when it's time. Holly opened the door and stepped inside. The space was warmer, quieter. She took off her coat, hung it up, set her bag down. Familiar movements, gentle ones, like a ritual of bringing her body back home. Outside, winter continued doing its work. But inside this small house, there was warmth enough to rest. And sometimes, one warm space is all it takes to make it through a season. Holly turned off a few lights and walked toward her bedroom. The night didn't ask her to see spring yet. It only asked her to rest so that when spring did arrive, she would still have the strength to notice it. Some endings aren't loud. There's no clear goodbye, no door slamming shut. Just an ordinary evening when you suddenly realize you've been standing in a doorway for too long, and behind you, a door has already closed quietly. Ben sat alone in the office. Most of the overhead lights were off now, leaving only the dim glow of his laptop screen and a small desk lamp tucked into the corner. Outside the glass wall, the city still held a few scattered lights, but they were thinning. The air conditioner hummed steadily, a background rhythm, trying to keep the space from falling into complete silence. Ben was 31, working in a startup, used to things being not finished. At home or at the office, his mind always carried a list: what still needed fixing, optimizing, catching up. For him, endings were usually just pauses before picking things back up. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the sense of "I'll restart this" didn't feel as certain. On the screen was a short email. Not many words. Not rude. Not dramatic. Just a polite notice that the partner was pulling out. A project he'd prepared for over months, calls, plans, pitch decks revised late into the night. And in the end, the result fit neatly into a few courteous lines. Ben had read the email many times. Each time his brain automatically searched for a crack. Maybe they'd change their mind. Maybe he could persuade them. Maybe he could revise the proposal. He was used to reopening doors that seemed closed. In the past, sometimes it worked. But some doors don't close because of a lack of effort. They close because the timing has shifted. He placed both hands on the keyboard as if typing a few lines could reverse everything. His fingers hovered, then stopped. He noticed the tension in his wrists, in his jaw too. A familiar bracing, like preparing for an argument or a final sprint. He let out a breath slower than usual, not because he was trying to calm down, just because his body was tired of staying ready to fight. Ben looked around the office. On the wall, a whiteboard filled with arrows, boxes, and half-erased notes. On the corner of the desk, an old coffee cup, the ice long melted. Everything looked like a place still in motion, even though the only person left was sitting still. He thought about the idea of a closed door. It sounded like a comforting phrase people used to soften disappointment. But tonight, it wasn't a phrase. It was physical. Like placing your hand on a doorknob, trying to turn it and realizing the lock is set. You can turn it again. You can knock. But the other side stays silent. What exhausted Ben wasn't losing the opportunity itself. It was the fact that his mind kept running, as if the opportunity were still in his hands. With each loop of thought, another version appeared. If only I'd sent the email earlier. If only I'd chosen different words. If only I hadn't missed that call. Those if onlys felt like standing in front of a closed door, blaming yourself for not stepping through in time. Ben rested a hand on the laptop lid. It was slightly warm. He didn't close it right away. He just kept his hand there, noticing a simple truth tonight. There might be nothing left to fix immediately, not because he had failed, but because the situation had changed shape. He stood and walked toward the glass wall. The city outside looked blurrier now. Distant lights made everything feel like it was drifting. Ben rested his forehead lightly against the cold glass, then stepped back. The chill pulled him into the present like a quiet reminder. I'm here, right now, in a silent room. He returned to the desk and sat down. This time he didn't open another tab. He didn't search for more data. He read the email once more, then let the cursor sit still. His hand rested on the trackpad, but didn't move. There was a very small moment, almost invisible from the outside, when Ben allowed himself not to know the next step. Not knowing didn't mean giving up. It meant that for the first time in months, he didn't have to force the future to be clear in the middle of the night. He closed the laptop. The soft click echoed quietly through the office. Not a slam, just the sound of something being set down. Ben stayed seated after that sound, feeling the silence flow into the space it created. A door had closed. But the most exhausting part wasn't the door itself. It was the habit of standing there, staring at it, and blaming yourself. And in this moment, Ben wasn't doing that anymore. He just sat, listened to the hum of the air conditioner, and let the night hold the rest for him. After closing the laptop, Ben didn't stand up right away. He stayed seated in the dimmer room, as if his body needed a buffer between running and stopped. The air conditioner kept humming unchanged, a steady background rhythm that kept the space from feeling too empty. He placed both hands on his thighs, not clenched, not tense, just resting there. It felt strange having hands that didn't need to be ready for the next task, but it also felt light, like setting down something he'd been carrying for too long. Ben stood up and turned off the desk lamp. The office sank into softer light enough to move around without seeing every detail clearly. The writing on the whiteboard faded into pale shapes. He didn't erase anything. There was no need. Those ideas had already done their work in that phase. He put on his jacket and stepped into the hallway. The office door closed behind him without a loud sound. Just the ordinary noise of a door being shut at the right time. Ben paused for a second, rested his hand on the handle, then walked away. He didn't look back. The hallway was quiet. Motion sensor lights turned on as he passed, then dimmed again behind him. Each section lit up, then faded, as if the building itself were guiding him into a different part of itself. Not fast, not slow. Outside, the night air was cool. Ben breathed in, then out. This breath wasn't cut short. No thoughts interrupted it. Just the breath of someone who had just stepped out of a closed room. He walked to the parking lot. The pavement reflected the lights in soft patches. Few cars, little noise. Ben opened his car door and sat down, but didn't start the engine yet. His hand rested on the steering wheel, feeling its familiar surface. A thought passed through him. If I don't keep going down the old path, where do I go next? But the question didn't tighten his chest like before. It was there, light, not demanding an answer right away. Like another room waiting, one that didn't need to be opened tonight. Ben started the car. The engine vibrated briefly, then settled. He drove out of the lot more slowly than usual. Not because he was tired, but because there was nothing he needed to chase right now. Traffic lights changed. The city at night unfolded in small sections. Ben didn't think about strategy, didn't think about emails, didn't think about proving anything. He let the road reveal itself piece by piece, just enough to drive. Some doors, when they close, don't immediately reveal another door in front of you. They create an empty space instead. And that space isn't always a loss. Sometimes it's the room you need to realize how cramped you've been standing for a long time. The car turned onto a familiar street. Porch lights glowed at a few houses. Ben slowed down and parked in front of his place. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment longer. Not out of regret, just because his body liked this slower rhythm. He went inside and turned on a small light. The space was quiet. Nothing needed fixing. Nothing was waiting to be finished. Ben set his keys on the table and hung his jacket on the hook. Small, ordinary movements, but they carried the feeling of coming home. He stood in the living room for a bit. Didn't turn on the TV, didn't check his phone. Just stood there, letting the silence spread. Maybe tomorrow he'd think about a different direction. Maybe another door would appear. Or maybe not yet. But tonight he didn't need to open any new doors. One had already closed, and he had stepped away from its threshold. Ben turned off the lights and walked toward the bedroom. The night didn't ask him to know where he was going next. It only asked him to rest inside the new space that had quietly opened the space of not having to push anymore. Fear doesn't always show up as panic. Sometimes it shows up as distance, a mind that keeps leaning forward, imagining everything that could go wrong, everything that hasn't happened yet. Your body might be standing still, but your thoughts are already far ahead, scanning the future, like it's a cliff you're about to fall from. Tyler learned this slowly. He was 34, a park ranger in a mountain region where people often came looking for quiet, but didn't always know what to do with it once they found it. That night, He was alone in the small ranger cabin, the kind with thick wooden walls and a single window facing the dark slope of the mountain. The wind moved through the trees outside low and steady, not loud enough to be dramatic, just present. Tyler wasn't afraid of the mountain itself. He'd hiked it in every season. He knew the trails, the loose rocks, the places where snow stayed longer than expected. What unsettled him wasn't the terrain, it was the stretch of unknown ahead of him. A transfer request he hadn't answered yet, a relationship that felt like it was quietly changing shape. A future that didn't look dangerous, but didn't look clear either. He sat at the small table, boots still on, jacket unzipped. His headlamp rested beside his hand. He picked it up, turned it on, and pointed it toward the floor. The beam cut a clean circle of light over the wooden boards. Everything beyond that circle stayed dark. Tyler noticed something he'd known for years, but had forgotten to apply to himself. When you're climbing in the dark, you don't look down the mountain. You don't look for the summit either. You look for the next place to put your foot. That's it. One step, then another. Fear has a way of convincing you to look everywhere except where you are. His thoughts kept pulling him forward. What if this choice closes the wrong door? What if I regret it? What if I don't see the danger coming? Each question widened the imagined drop in front of him. The future became a vast space with no edges, no markers, no handholds. Tyler exhaled slowly and brought the light back down to the floor. The wood grain, a scratch near the leg of the chair, dust that would need to be swept in the morning. Ordinary things, solid things. The kind of details that don't disappear when you're afraid. Outside, the wind shifted. A branch tapped lightly against the cabin wall, then went still again. The mountain wasn't rushing him. The night wasn't demanding answers. He remembered his first winter climb years ago, how his instructor had stopped him mid-trail when Tyler froze, staring down a steep slope. "Don't argue with the height," the man had said quietly. "Just place your foot." Back then it hadn't felt like wisdom. It had felt like survival. Now, sitting alone in the cabin, Tyler understood it differently. Fear wasn't asking him to solve his life. It was just asking for attention. And attention didn't mean obedience. He stood up, took a few steps toward the door, then paused. His hand rested on the handle. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He just needed to feel the weight of his body balanced upright here. There was something grounding about realizing that even if the path ahead changed, this step, this moment, was stable. The floor held him. The walls held the warmth. The night held everything else without explanation. Tyler turned off the headlamp and let the darkness return. It didn't feel threatening now. It felt wide, like a space that didn't need to be filled. Fear often imagines the worst possible version of tomorrow. But tomorrow never arrives all at once. It comes as moments, steps, small decisions made with the information you have, not the information you wish you had. Tyler sat back down. He unlaced his boots slowly, listening to the soft rasp of fabric and metal. When he finished, he lined them up by the door, neat but not perfect. He didn't check his phone. He didn't rehearse conversations that hadn't happened yet. He let the mountain be what it was, something large, something steady, something that didn't need him to conquer it tonight. Sometimes peace doesn't come from feeling brave. It comes from remembering that you're not required to see the whole path, only the ground beneath you. The wind outside softened. The cabin settled into its quiet creaks and pauses. Tyler leaned back in his chair and allowed his gaze to rest on nothing in particular. The next step could wait. For now, this one was enough. Later that night, the cabin grew quieter in a way Tyler could feel rather than hear. The wind didn't stop, it just became part of the background, like a low breath moving through the trees. The kind of sound you don't need to follow. The kind that keeps going whether you pay attention or not. Tyler lay back on the narrow bed near the wall. He didn't turn off the small lamp right away. Its light was soft, barely reaching the corners of the room, leaving most things in shadow. The ceiling above him was simple wood. Nothing to figure out, nothing to interpret. His mind tried once or twice to wander ahead again, to the transfer request, to the future version of himself that might look back and judge this moment. But the thoughts didn't have the same grip. They arrived without urgency, then drifted off when nothing responded. He brought his attention to his body instead. The way the mattress supported his weight, the way his shoulders sank slightly once he stopped holding them up, the quiet rhythm of his breath already slower than before. In the mountains, Tyler knew panic often came from looking too far. People slipped not because the ground disappeared, but because their attention did. They leaned forward before their footing was secure. Fear works the same way in the mind. Tyler let that idea pass without holding on to it. He didn't need to turn it into ideas. He'd learned enough to know that understanding something didn't always mean doing something with it. Outside, a distant animal call echoed once, then faded. It didn't trigger alarm. It was just another reminder that the night had its own movements, its own language. One that didn't ask for interpretation. Tyler reached over and turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room, but not completely. There was still a thin outline of the window, a faint suggestion of trees beyond it. Enough to orient himself, enough to feel safe. He remembered how on night climbs, experienced climbers trusted their lights not to show the whole route, but to show enough. Enough rock, enough ground, enough information to take the next step without guessing. That was all the light was ever meant to do. Fear often demands certainty. It wants guarantees, full maps, complete explanations. But the body doesn't need all that to rest. The body only needs to know that right now, it's not falling. Tyler placed one hand on his chest, the other resting loosely at his side. His fingers were relaxed, not curled into fists. His breath moved in and out without effort, without correction. The mountain didn't ask him to decide anything tonight. The future didn't ask him to arrive early. There was a quiet relief in realizing that uncertainty wasn't a threat. It was simply space. Space where things hadn't formed yet. Space that didn't need to be filled with fear. Tyler's thoughts grew less specific. They lost their sharp edges, becoming more like impressions than sentences. The idea of tomorrow softened. The need to resolve anything faded into the background. He didn't tell himself to sleep. He didn't tell himself to relax. He just stayed with the steady feeling of being held by the bed. stayed with the sound of wind passing through branches, stayed with the simple fact of being here now, without needing to move. At some point, the distinction between listening and drifting began to blur. His awareness widened, then thinned like a beam of light slowly dimming. The path ahead would still be there in the morning. The choices would still wait. For now there was no cliff, only solid ground beneath him, only one step already taken, and that was enough to let the night carry the rest. The hotel room was quiet in the particular way only hotel rooms are. Not truly silent, but padded. The air conditioner hummed steadily, a low, even sound that felt like it was holding the room together. Ava lay on the bed with one arm draped over her stomach, the other resting along her side, still in her work clothes, shoes kicked off near the door where they had landed. She had arrived less than an hour ago, but the sense of dislocation had already settled in. Different city, same carpet, same heavy curtains, same faint smell of detergent and recycled air. Ava had learned to recognize that feeling early in her career, the sense of being everywhere and nowhere at once. She was 29 and worked as a flight attendant. From the outside, it sounded glamorous. Travel, movement, a life that didn't sit still long enough to get boring. People often said they were jealous. Ava smiled when they did. It was easier than explaining the parts that didn't show up in photos. Tonight's flight had been smooth. Short conversations, polite passengers, nothing memorable. And yet, as soon as she closed the hotel door behind her, the quiet had pressed in heavier than expected. Ava rolled onto her side and stared at the thin strip of light leaking around the curtain. Somewhere beyond it, a city she barely knew was going about its evening. People meeting friends, people going home, people sleeping in beds that didn't change every few nights. She reached for the remote and turned the TV on, then off again almost immediately. The voices felt too close, too awake. She preferred the steady sound of the air conditioner, constant and indifferent. Ava pushed herself up and sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on her thighs. She bent forward slightly, letting her head hang for a moment long enough to feel the blood shift, long enough for the day to slide out of focus. She'd been good at moving for as long as she could remember. Good at adapting, good at smiling, and being pleasant in short bursts. But nights like this always brought the same question quietly, without accusation. Where do I actually belong? Not in a dramatic way. She wasn't lonely exactly. She had friends. She had a job she liked well enough. But sometimes, especially in hotel rooms that all looked the same, she felt like a small point of light drifting between places, never landing long enough to be named. Ava stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see out. The city below was a scatter of lights, uneven and distant. Cars moved along dark lines of road. A few buildings glowed brighter than others. No single light stood out for long. She leaned her forehead lightly against the glass and exhaled. Earlier that day, during a layover, she'd overheard a passenger talking about stars. About how some were so far away that the light reaching us now had started its journey millions of years ago. Some of those stars don't even exist anymore, the passenger had said casually. But we still see them. That idea had stayed with her. Ava looked at the lights below and thought about how often she felt small in comparison to everything else. How easy it was to believe that if she wasn't central, she must be insignificant. That if no one was looking directly at her, she might as well not be there at all. She pulled the curtain back into place and returned to the bed, sitting cross-legged, now hands resting loosely in her lap. The air conditioner clicked softly as it adjusted, then returned to its steady hum. Ava closed her eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to pause. She noticed how her body felt when it wasn't bracing for the next announcement, the next boarding call, the next smile. There was a faint ache in her shoulders, a tiredness behind her eyes, and beneath that, something gentler, a quiet persistence. She thought about stars again, about how many of them we never notice. Not because they aren't shining, but because the sky is vast and our attention is limited. A star doesn't stop being a star just because it isn't named or pointed at. That thought didn't make her feel special. It made her feel allowed to be small without being meaningless, allowed to be quiet without disappearing. Ava lay back and stared at the ceiling. The room felt less foreign now, its edges softening as her breathing slowed. The air conditioner continued its steady work, filling the space with something predictable. She didn't need to decide where she belonged tonight. She didn't need to anchor herself to one place to be real. She could exist exactly as she was moving, passing through, leaving small traces of light behind her without tracking where they landed. Some stars don't guide ships. Some don't carry names. They still shine. Ava felt her eyelids grow heavy as that idea settled in her body. Not as a belief to hold on to, but as a quiet truth she didn't need to defend. The room held her gently anonymous and safe as the night deepened around the window. Ava lay still as the room continued its quiet work around her. The air conditioner hummed without change, steady and unconcerned. Outside, the city lights shifted slightly as clouds moved through the sky, softening some points of brightness while allowing others to come through more clearly. She rested one hand on her stomach and felt the gentle rise and fall of her breath. Each inhale arrived on its own, each exhale left without being held. Her body knew how to do this part without instruction. For a long time, Ava had believed that being visible meant being valuable. That if her presence didn't register strongly, if it didn't leave an impression, it must not have mattered. That belief had followed her from place to place, quietly shaping how she saw herself during layovers, conversations, even moments of rest. But stars don't measure their worth by how many eyes find them. They don't dim themselves when no one is looking. They don't rush to become brighter than the sky around them. The thought settled in her slowly, like light spreading after dusk. Ava didn't feel grand or important. She felt relieved, as if she had been released from a task she didn't remember agreeing to. She shifted slightly, pulling the blanket up and letting the weight of it ground her. The bed held her without preference. The room didn't ask for her story. It didn't need her to be interesting. Ava thought about the places she'd passed through over the years. Airports that blurred together. Hotel rooms she could barely distinguish from one another. Faces she remembered without names. All those moments had felt temporary, almost disposable, as if they didn't count because they didn't last. But nothing about a star's light is wasted. Even the faintest glow travels far beyond its origin, touching things it will never see. That idea softened something deep in her chest. Maybe her life didn't need a single fixed center to be meaningful. Maybe meaning could move with her, appearing wherever she was willing to be present, even briefly. She closed her eyes and let the darkness behind her eyelids deepen. The city outside continued without her participation. Cars moved, elevators rose and fell. Somewhere a door opened and closed. The room stayed steady. Ava noticed how much quieter her mind had become. The questions about belonging didn't feel urgent anymore. They could wait. They always could. She remembered standing at windows like this before in other cities, other nights, feeling the same smallness and mistaking it for emptiness. Tonight, that smallness felt different. It felt like space, not empty, open. The air conditioner clicked once, then resumed its hum. Ava's breathing matched it naturally, slow and even. The edges of her thoughts blurred, one dissolving into the next without resistance. She didn't need to shine in a particular way. She didn't need to be central. She didn't need to leave a mark she could track. Being here was enough. Shining quietly was enough. Some stars are seen, some are not. The sky makes room for all of them. Ava drifted toward sleep with that understanding resting gently in her body. The hotel room holding her like a temporary sky, neutral, quiet, and complete. Carla noticed the crack while she was washing dishes. It wasn't new. That was the strange part. The small ceramic bowl had been chipped for a long time, a thin line running from the rim down one side, like a quiet scar. She had used it dozens of times without really seeing it. Tonight, under the warm kitchen light, it caught her attention. She slowed her hands in the sink, letting the water run over the bowl. The crack darkened slightly as it filled, then lightened again as the water drained away. The sound of the faucet was steady, familiar, the kind of sound that made the rest of the house feel calmer. Carla was 48 and worked as a hairstylist. All day she stood behind people adjusting smoothing, making small corrections so others could leave feeling more put together than when they arrived. She was good at it. She had learned how to notice tiny details and fix them gently without drawing attention to the flaw. It rarely occurred to her to do the same for herself. She turned the bowl in her hands, studying the crack more closely now. It wasn't jagged. It didn't threaten to break apart. It simply existed, part of the bowl's shape, part of its history. Earlier that evening, a client had laughed and said, "You're so confident, I wish I was more like you." Carla had smiled and changed the subject the way she always did. Confidence felt like the wrong word. She felt capable, yes, reliable, but confident implied something unbroken, something smooth. Carla set the bowl in the drying rack and reached for a towel. As she dried her hands, her eyes drifted to the stack of mismatched dishes on the counter. None of them were perfect. Small chips, faded patterns, items collected over years rather than chosen all at once. She had always liked it that way. A kitchen that looked lived in. And yet, when it came to herself, she held a different standard. She noticed every crack, every place where she felt she should have healed faster, known better, been stronger by now. The faucet clicked off. The kitchen settled into a deeper quiet, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock above the fridge. Carla leaned her hip against the counter and let her shoulders relax forward. She thought about the word flawed, how easily it attached itself to people. How often she had described herself that way in her own head, as if a crack automatically meant something was damaged beyond use. Carla picked the bowl up again and held it at eye level. The light caught the glaze unevenly along the crack, creating a faint line of reflection. It wasn't ugly. If anything, it made the bowl more interesting, more honest. She remembered something she had read years ago about old pottery in Japan. How cracks were sometimes repaired with gold, not to hide the break, but to highlight it. The idea had stayed with her, even if she couldn't remember the name for it. The bowl in her hands hadn't been repaired with gold. No one had tried to make the crack beautiful. And still, it held water. It held food. It did exactly what it was meant to do. Carla felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the kind that came when she thought about her own past. Relationships that hadn't lasted. Choices she replayed late at night, the quiet belief that if she were less marked, life would have gone more smoothly. She set the bowl back down carefully and rested both palms on the counter. The surface was cool, solid, trustworthy. She took a slow breath and let it out without shaping it. What if being whole didn't mean being uncracked? What if it simply meant being able to hold what life placed inside you? The thought didn't demand an answer. It stayed there like the bowl on the counter, waiting to be noticed. Carla turned off the kitchen light and left the room dim, letting the glow from the living room spill in instead. The crack in the bowl was harder to see now, but she knew it was still there. And for the first time that evening, that didn't feel like a problem. Carla left the kitchen and moved into the living room, not turning on any more lights. The house felt different in the dimness, softer, less demanding. Shadows settled into corners without being asked to explain themselves. She sat down on the couch and let her back sink into the cushions, arms resting where they fell. The image of the bowl stayed with her, not as a symbol she needed to analyze, but as a quiet presence, something ordinary that had done its job without pretending to be untouched. She thought about how often she had treated her own life as if it were supposed to look unused. No visible wear, no chips, no signs that anything had ever pressed too hard. And when the marks showed up anyway, she'd taken them as evidence of failure instead of evidence of living. Carla crossed her legs and leaned her head back against the couch. The fabric was worn smooth in places, shaped by years of use. She liked that about it. It held her without trying to impress her. She remembered moments she usually avoided thinking about. Times she had trusted too much, stayed too long, left too early. None of them felt sharp tonight. They felt distant, like old weather that had already passed through. The bowl hadn't cracked because it was weak. It had cracked because it had been used, held heat, held weight, been part of countless small moments that mattered enough to leave a trace. Carla felt something ease in her chest as that understanding settled. She didn't need to repair herself to be acceptable. She didn't need to hide the places where life had pressed in. Those places didn't cancel her usefulness. They explained it. She stood up and walked back into the kitchen, drawn there without urgency. The bowl sat quietly in the drying rack, a thin line visible along its side. Carla lifted it again, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. It was steady, reliable. She filled it with water and carried it carefully to the sink. The bowl held the water without leaking, without protest. The crack didn't compromise its purpose. It simply told a story. Carla set the bowl down and turned off the remaining light. The kitchen faded into shadow, leaving only the faint outline of shapes she knew well. She didn't need to see everything clearly to trust it. In the bedroom, she changed into something soft and loose movements, slow, unhurried. The mirror caught her reflection briefly. She didn't look away. She didn't search for flaws. She just saw a woman who had been shaped by years of showing up. Carla lay down and pulled the blanket over herself, letting the weight settle across her shoulders. Her breathing slowed naturally, without direction. The day began to loosen its hold. She thought again of the pottery repaired with gold, the way cracks were honored instead of hidden. Not because suffering was beautiful, but because survival was honest. Maybe wholeness wasn't about returning to an unmarked state. Maybe it was about holding everything past present memory without falling apart. Carla felt her thoughts grow quieter, edges blurring. The crack no longer felt like something that needed attention. It simply existed, integrated, complete in its own way. The house rested around her, familiar and imperfect. The night moved forward without expectation. Somewhere the bowl waited in the kitchen, ready to be used again tomorrow. Carla closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest, without fixing, without correcting, without pretending to be unbroken. Nothing needed to be repaired tonight. Nothing needed to be hidden. She drifted toward sleep whole, not because she was flawless, but because she was still here, still holding still enough. Henry paused on the porch before sitting down, as if checking whether the night was settled enough to hold him. The wooden boards were cool beneath his bare feet. A porch swing hung slightly off-center, moving just a little in the breeze, its chain making a soft, familiar creak. Somewhere beyond the yard, crickets kept time without hurry. He lowered himself onto the swing and let it take his weight. The motion was gentle, almost accidental. Back and forth, back and forth. Not enough to call it rocking, just enough to feel carried. Henry was 58 and recently retired from the military. For most of his adult life, his days had been planned down to the minute. Wake times, briefings, objectives, even rest had been scheduled. Now, for the first time in decades, there was space. Long unmarked stretches of it. People had congratulated him, told him he'd earned this, asked what he was going to do next. Henry never quite knew how to answer. He had expected retirement to feel like relief, and sometimes it did. But more often, it felt like standing in shallow water, searching for something deeper without knowing where to swim. He wasn't unhappy. He just felt restless. as if peace were nearby but just out of reach. The swing creaked again as Henry shifted his weight. He rested his hands on his thighs and looked out at the dark yard. The grass moved slightly in the breeze, each blade responding in its own small way. The air smelled like damp earth and old wood. Earlier that evening, he had found himself pacing the house, moving from room to room without purpose. He'd opened the fridge, then closed it, picked up his phone, then set it back down. The habits of motion were still there, even when there was nothing left to complete. Henry had spent years believing happiness was something you arrived at. A point on the map. A reward at the end of enough effort. He had chased it in promotions, in achievements, in the quiet pride of being useful. And now that the chasing had stopped, the question lingered. Why doesn't it feel the way I thought it would? He leaned his head back against the porch post and let his eyes rest on the dark sky. Clouds moved slowly across it, thinning and thickening, revealing stars and then covering them again. Nothing dramatic, just steady change. Henry remembered a story someone had told him once long ago during a quiet watch. A simple story, almost a joke. A fish swimming from place to place, asking everyone it met where to find the ocean. The other fish looked at it strangely and said, "This is the ocean." And the fish replied, "No, this is water. I'm looking for the ocean." At the time, Henry had laughed and moved on. Tonight, the story returned with a different weight. He thought about how often he'd treated happiness the same way. Always just ahead, just beyond the next assignment, the next chapter, the next version of himself. He had been swimming in it, perhaps without ever noticing. The swing continued its quiet motion. Henry felt his breathing begin to match it. In, out. No effort required. His shoulders dropped slightly, a small release he hadn't asked for. He noticed how the night held everything without comment. The sounds, the dark, the slow movement of air. Nothing was trying to improve him. Nothing was asking him to be more than he was right now. Henry realized how deeply he had believed that peace required a different set of circumstances. Less noise, fewer questions, a clearer sense of direction. And yet sitting here, he couldn't point to anything missing. The porch light cast a warm circle around him, leaving the rest of the yard in shadow. The boundary felt kind, not limiting. Enough light to sit. Enough darkness to rest his eyes. He thought about all the times he had postponed contentment. After this tour, after this promotion, after I finally slowed down. Each time the finish line had moved a little further out. What if the ocean wasn't somewhere else? What if it was the very thing he had been moving through all along? The thought didn't feel exciting. It felt quiet, almost obvious. The kind of realization that doesn't change anything on the outside, but loosens something on the inside. Henry placed his feet flat on the porch and let the swing slow to a stop. The night didn't rush him. It didn't need him to arrive anywhere. He sat there breathing, listening, feeling the simple fact of being held by the moment. Not searching, not reaching, just floating. And for the first time since retiring, the restlessness eased, not because it had been answered, but because it no longer needed to be. Henry let the swing come to rest and stayed there anyway, as if the movement had simply shifted inward. The night felt settled now, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, only complete. The crickets kept their rhythm. The air moved when it needed to, and then grew still again. He noticed how different his body felt when he stopped scanning for what was next. His chest wasn't tight anymore. His jaw rested easily. Even the small ache in his lower back felt neutral, like something that didn't need to be fixed right now. For most of his life, Henry had trusted effort, motion, progress. Those things had carried him far, and he didn't resent them. But sitting on the porch, surrounded by the simple sounds of the night, he realized effort had also trained him to overlook what didn't require earning. Peace, it turned out, didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with a sense of accomplishment. It felt more like permission, the permission to stop swimming for a moment and notice the water already holding you. Henry rested his hands loosely on his thighs and closed his eyes. Not to think, just to feel. The weight of his body on the swing, the steady ground beneath the porch, the air entering his lungs and leaving again without being asked. The story of the fish returned softer this time. The fish hadn't been foolish. It had been sincere. It simply hadn't known how to recognize the ocean because it had never experienced anything else. The search had made sense until it didn't. Henry smiled faintly at that. He had been sincere too. He had done what he knew how to do. He had chased what he believed would finally feel like enough. And now, with nothing left to chase, he could see it more clearly. The ocean wasn't a destination. It was a condition. It was the space that allowed everything else to move. The quiet support underneath effort, underneath struggle, underneath even the search itself. It had been present during every assignment, every long night, every question about what came next. Henry hadn't missed it. He just hadn't needed to notice it before. The porch light hummed softly above him. A cloud slid across the stars, dimming them, and then letting them reappear. Nothing in the sky seemed concerned about being seen the whole time. He thought about the future briefly, about mornings without alarms, days without clear objectives. The thought didn't scare him the way it had before. It felt open, wide, like water. Henry stood and pushed the swing gently so it wouldn't creak anymore, then stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The house welcomed him with the familiar smell of wood and quiet. He didn't turn on any lights. He didn't need to see everything clearly. In the bedroom, he moved slowly, changing into something comfortable, each motion unhurried. When he lay down, the bed accepted his weight easily. His breathing deepened without instruction. The day loosened its grip and slid away. As sleep approached, Henry felt the last trace of searching fade. There was nowhere he needed to get to tonight. Nothing he needed to solve. He was already in it. He always had been. The ocean didn't require recognition to be vast. It simply held. And held by that understanding, Henry drifted into rest, no longer looking for happiness, but finally allowing himself to feel the water he had been swimming in all along. There are moments when you've already gotten on the ride, already taken your seat, and yet your body still refuses to rest. Not because the ride is rough, not because the road is difficult. It's just that you're still carrying your baggage on your shoulders even though you don't need to anymore. And by evening, the tiredness doesn't come from the distance traveled, but from not letting yourself set the load down. Marcus is 41 years old. He works as a delivery driver. His whole day is a series of trips, stop deliver sign, get back in the vehicle, repeat. When his shift ends, he drives back to the parking lot behind the warehouse, turns off the engine but stays seated in the driver's seat. The motor is quiet now. His body isn't. He keeps both hands on the steering wheel longer than necessary. Not gripping it, just resting them there. As if letting go might cause something to slip away. Outside, the lot slowly empties. A few cars pull out red taillights, stretching into lines before disappearing. Marcus stays where he is, shoulders slightly raised, his back not fully aware of the seat behind him. Nothing major went wrong today. No serious delays, no complaints. And yet, in his mind, there's a long list of things he could have done better. Delivered a little earlier, spoken a little more smoothly to a customer, driven a little faster on that one stretch of road. Each thought isn't heavy on its own, but together they're enough to keep his shoulders from dropping. Marcus opens the door and steps out of the vehicle. The evening air is cooler, carrying the scent of asphalt and a light breeze. He stretches his arms, rolls his neck a few times. On his back is the familiar backpack. Not very heavy, but after carrying it all day, the strain is clearly etched into his shoulders. He takes the backpack off and places it on the passenger seat. A small movement, but as the straps leave his shoulders, Marcus exhales more deeply than usual, as if his body had been waiting for that exact moment. He stands beside the vehicle, leaning lightly against the door, looking out over the quiet parking lot. Some people are used to carrying everything themselves. So used to it that even when they don't have to, they still do. Like wearing a backpack while already sitting on the bus. Not because they don't trust the ride, but because they've grown accustomed to being responsible for every bit of movement. Marcus remembers riding the bus as a child, gripping his backpack tightly, afraid of dropping it, forgetting it, losing it. As he grew older, that habit didn't disappear. It just changed shape. The backpack stopped being books and notebooks and became responsibility, worry, and the feeling that he always had to be ready. He opens the car door and sits back down in the driver's seat. This time, his back rests fully against it. The seat supports his weight, something he rarely notices during the day. Marcus places his hands on his thighs. He's no longer holding the steering wheel. He doesn't need to hold anything. A familiar thought appears. What if something happens? He notices it and lets it stay. No answer, no argument. He looks at it the way you look at an old roadside sign. You know it's there, but you don't need to stop for it. Marcus closes his eyes for a few seconds. Not to sleep, just to feel the seat holding him. The engine is off. Nothing is moving. And in that stillness, he realizes something very simple. There are parts of the journey you don't need to walk yourself. You just need to sit still and let the vehicle do its job. He opens his eyes, takes the backpack from the passenger seat and places it on the floor of the car. Not on his shoulders anymore. Not because he won't need it tomorrow, just because right now it isn't necessary. The parking lot remains quiet. Nothing falls apart when he sets it down. If you're listening to this and feel tired even though you're done for the day, that's okay. Maybe you've already gotten on the ride, but you're still wearing the backpack, and tonight you don't need to prove that you can carry more. You're already on the ride. It's already carrying you. You can let your shoulders rest. Marcus stays in the car a little longer. No music, no phone. Just sitting there with the windows closed, the quiet parking lot, and the yellow lights spread evenly across the pavement. The backpack rests on the floor of the car, no longer touching his shoulders. The brief sense of emptiness passes quickly, replaced by a lightness he didn't expect. He leans further back into the seat. The car supports his full weight, his back, his hips, his shoulders. When he doesn't have to hold himself up, his body naturally finds a more comfortable position. A long exhale leaves him. Not forced, just happening. Some days we believe that if we stop carrying everything, things will fall apart. But tonight, as Marcus sits still in a car with the engine off, he sees the opposite. Everything is still there. Still okay. Even when he isn't carrying it on his shoulders. He opens the car door and steps outside. No rush. The backpack stays inside. He locks the door and stands there for a moment, looking around. A light breeze moves through. Distant insects hum. There's no sound asking him to react. No task waiting for him. Marcus walks toward his own car parked in another part of the lot. The path is short and familiar. When he gets in, he doesn't put the backpack on again. He places it on the back seat instead. A small decision, but his shoulders feel lighter immediately. The car rolls forward. Streetlights pass one by one, steady and calm. Marcus drives a little slower than usual. Not because he's tired, just because there's no need to hurry. In the rearview mirror, the cars behind him aren't pressing. The road is wide enough for him to move at his own pace. A thought shows up. Should I squeeze in one more task? Marcus notices it and lets it drift past. Right now, the car is doing its job, and his only job is to sit there, hold the wheel gently, and allow himself to be carried. When he gets home, Marcus parks by the entrance. He turns off the engine and stays still for a few seconds. Inside the house, the lights are off. No one is waiting for an explanation. No one needs him to keep trying. He opens the door, steps inside, and leaves the backpack near the entrance, not carrying it deeper into the house. In the living room, Marcus sits down on the couch. The backrest supports him just like the car seat did earlier. His body seems to remember how to be held again without bracing, without tightening. If you're listening to this and recognize how used you are to carrying everything yourself, that's okay. Many people grow up believing that holding it all together is what keeps them safe. But tonight, you can try something different. Let the ride carry you a little farther. You don't have to put everything down. Just the things you don't need to carry into sleep. Marcus stands and walks into the bedroom. He changes clothes, turns off the light, and lies down. When his head meets the pillow, his shoulders are no longer as tight as they were earlier in the car. His body remembers how to rest. If you fall asleep at some point while listening, that's completely okay. If you're still awake, you're still moving in a very safe rhythm. Tonight you're already on the ride. It's already carrying you. You can leave the backpack behind and let your shoulders rest for a while. Sometimes the problem isn't that things are too complicated. It's that we're in a hurry. We want everything untangled right away. We want our minds to feel clear immediately. We want the discomfort to disappear as fast as possible. And that urgency is often what makes everything more tangled. Chloe is 22 years old. She works retail at a large store. Her shift ends close to 10 at night. When she gets back to her room, she drops into a chair, kicks off her shoes, and pulls her earbuds out of her jacket pocket. The cord is twisted into a small knot, familiar somehow, always like this. Chloe frowns. She tugs gently at one end. Nothing happens. She pulls a little harder. The knot tightens. She exhales sharply, a bit irritated. Why is it always like this? It's a small sentence, but it carries the weight of the whole day. She stands up and paces a few steps around the room, the tangled earbuds still in her hand. Her mind feels just as knotted. A comment from her manager, a difficult customer. A familiar thought slips in. Maybe I'm just not very good at this. The thoughts hook into each other. The more she pulls on them, the tighter they feel. Chloe sits down on the bed. She lets the earbuds fall onto the mattress. She stops pulling. She just looks. Under the warm yellow light, the cord becomes clearer. It isn't one impossible mess. It's just many small loops caught together. She uses 2 fingers to lift a section of the cord, turns it slightly, then sets it back down. Slowly. With no goal of fixing everything at once. Just testing one spot. One small loop loosens. Not much, but enough that the whole knot isn't as tight as before. There's something Chloe knows well, even if she rarely puts it into words. When her mind feels tangled, she tries to solve it fast. Find the right answer. Make a decision immediately. Get clarity now. But just like the earbuds, some things don't respond to force. Pulling harder doesn't move them forward, it just tightens the knot. She keeps going. Lift, turn, set down. No yanking, no tugging. When one loop refuses to budge, she leaves it alone and moves to another place. Strangely, when she stops focusing on the tightest knot, other parts begin to loosen on their own. As she works, her thoughts slow down too. They don't disappear, but they stop crowding each other. She's no longer replaying her manager's words. Not because she's resolved them, but because her hands are busy with something slow enough to bring her back to the present moment. At some point, Chloe notices her shoulders have dropped. Her neck feels less tight. Her exhales are steadier. Small changes, but real ones. She isn't trying to relax. She simply stopped rushing. Some problems in our minds are exactly like this tangle of earbuds. Not impossible to fix, just impossible to fix with force. They need patience more than determination, and sometimes the biggest step is simply stopping the hard pull. Chloe sets the earbuds down and stretches her hands. She looks out the window. Streetlights reflect off the wet sidewalk below. A car passes, then fades into the distance. Nothing out there is asking anything of her. She turns back to the earbuds. Another loop loosens. Then another, There's no moment where everything is suddenly done. Just a knot that's slowly becoming easier to breathe around, much like her mind right now. If you're listening to this and recognize how often you try to untangle your thoughts too quickly, that's okay. Many people do. But tonight you might not need to pull so hard. You can set things down and loosen them one small step at a time. At some point, Chloe notices the room has grown quieter. Not because all sound has disappeared, but because nothing is pulling her attention too far away anymore. The wall clock ticks steadily. Traffic outside is thinned. The warm yellow light in the room hasn't changed, but the way she feels inside has. The earbuds on the bed are no longer tightly knotted like they were at first. There are still a few small loops tangled together, but they don't irritate her anymore. Chloe lifts one end of the cord, lets the rest fall softly onto the mattress. She doesn't pull. She just raises it, turns her wrist slightly, then sets it down again. Another loop loosens on its own. She realizes she doesn't need to untangle everything right now. The earbuds already work. The rest can wait. That realization feels much lighter than the pressure of having to finish it all. A familiar thought flickers through her mind. I always leave things unfinished. This time Chloe doesn't react. She doesn't blame herself. She doesn't argue back. She lets the thought drift by like a thin strand of wire that no longer catches on anything. She coils the earbuds loosely, not trying to make them neat, just enough to place them in the drawer. When her hand closes the drawer, it feels like she's set down one more thing from the day. Chloe stands and walks into the bathroom. She washes her hands with warm water. The feeling of water running between her fingers helps her notice how tired her hands actually are. Not from heavy work, but from gripping too tightly for too long. As the soap rinses away, her fingers relax on their own. She looks at herself in the mirror, not searching for flaws, not judging, just looking. Someone who's made it through a long day and is learning not to pull so hard at everything anymore. Back in her room, Chloe turns off the main light, leaving only the small lamp by the bed. She sits down, pulls the blanket up to her thighs, then lies back fully. The bed supports her body. She doesn't need to balance herself. She doesn't need to think any further. Some nights, the best thing you can do for yourself isn't to solve every tangle, but to stop making them tighter. No pulling. No yanking, no forcing clarity. If there are still a few loose wires in your mind, that's okay. They don't need to be untangled before sleep. They can stay right where they are, harmless, as long as you don't keep pulling on them. Chloe turns onto her side. Her breathing slows. Not perfectly even, but comfortable. She isn't thinking about tomorrow. She isn't thinking about her next shift. She lets her body do what it already knows how to do. Rest. If you fall asleep at some point while listening to this story, that's completely fine. If you're still awake, you're still moving in a very safe rhythm. You don't need to untangle everything. You don't need full clarity. You only need to release the force and let things stay as they are. Listen a little longer, or drift off whenever you'd like. There are times when we believe we're holding everything very carefully. Holding relationships, holding onto work, holding our image in other people's eyes, holding the future steady so it doesn't drift off the path we planned. But the tighter we hold, the more our hands begin to ache. And the strange truth is, the harder we grip, the more we lose. Grace is 62 years old, a retired librarian. She lives alone in a small house in the suburbs. That evening, she sits on the old porch swing outside. It creaks softly with each gentle sway. Night has fully settled in. The sun is gone. Only the warm yellow light from inside the house spills out just enough to reveal the yard in front of her. On the small table beside the swing sits a potted plant. The soil on top is dry. Grace reaches out and pinches a small handful between her fingers. The dirt is fine, mixed with tiny grains of sand. When she closes her hand, a few grains slip through and fall onto the porch floor with a faint, gritty sound. Grace opens her hand. The soil rests there quietly, more of it than before. She looks at that moment longer than she normally would. Not because it's special, just because it matches the feeling she's been carrying inside for months now. Since retiring, Grace has had more time. But with that time have come uninvited thoughts. Am I still useful? Am I falling behind? If I don't have my job anymore, who am I? Those questions have made her grip tightly onto whatever she still has. Her routines, her relationships, her old habits. As if letting go would cause everything to slip away at once. She picks up another pinch of soil. This time she squeezes harder. More sand falls. Tiny grains escape through the spaces between her fingers, impossible to hold. Grace exhales slowly. Not sadly, just noticing. Some things in life don't slip away because we didn't hold them tightly enough. They slip away because we held them the wrong way. Like sand. It doesn't respond to pressure. It needs to be held gently, not crushed. Grace returns the soil to the pot. She smooths a thin layer over the surface and pats it lightly. A familiar movement, no thought required. When she gardens, she knows this instinctively. Plants don't need to be gripped. They need space. Space for roots to breathe, for water to soak in, for light to reach them. She leans back into the porch swing. The steady creak rocks the quiet air. She notices her shoulders are tense, not painful, just holding. She lets them soften, allowing the swing to support her back. Her exhale grows a little longer. A memory drifts up. A day at the beach when she was young, trying to carry sand home in her fist. She squeezed as hard as she could, but when she opened her hand, only a few grains clung to her skin. She remembers feeling disappointed. Now she smiles at the memory. Sand was never meant to be taken. It was meant to be felt, and then left behind. Grace looks out at the dark yard. There's nothing she needs to guard, no one she needs to prove herself to. Just a quiet evening and someone relearning how to open her hand. If you're listening to this and recognize how tightly you've been holding things, plans, emotions, the future, that's okay. Many people do it out of fear of losing. But tonight you might not need to grip so hard. Maybe you don't lose things when you open your hand. Maybe you're tired because you've been holding on for too long. Grace lifts her hand in front of her and opens her palm. Not clenched, not stretched wide. just open enough. A cool breeze passes over it, gentle, taking nothing away. She rests her hand on the arm of the swing. The soil stays in the pot. The sand stays on the porch. Nothing disappears when she stops squeezing, and in that very quiet moment, Grace understands some things. When held with gentleness, stay much longer than anything we try to grip tightly. Grace remains on the porch swing. The night has grown deeper, the air noticeably cooler. The daytime sounds have faded, leaving only a few distant, barely there noises, as if the whole neighborhood is slowing down together. She rests both hands on her thighs. Her palms are open, not stretched wide, not clenched, just open enough to rest. The swing moves gently, creaking in a steady rhythm. Not fast, not slow. Like the breathing of someone who no longer needs to keep watch. Grace looks at her hands, hands that worked for an entire lifetime, holding books, taking notes, organizing, preserving. For a long time, she believed her value lived in what those hands could hold, keeping things in place, preventing disorder. But tonight, with her hands open, she doesn't feel loss. She feels light. A breeze passes by, not strong, not carrying anything away. It touches her skin, then moves on. Grace doesn't react by closing her hands. She lets the wind pass, like letting a thought pass, without needing to keep it. There are things in life we only realize never truly belong to us when we stop gripping them. They were only passing through, borrowing us for a moment, so they could be felt. Like sand, like wind, like rolls we carried for many years until it was time to set them down. Grace stands slowly. She lifts the small potted plant and pours a little water into the soil. Not much, just enough. The water sinks in naturally without pooling. The earth absorbs it in its own way. No force required. She places the plant back where it was, wipes her hands on the small towel hanging by the door. The cloth is soft. The movement is gentle. There's nothing to hurry, nothing to hold. Inside the house, Grace doesn't turn on any more lights. The glow is just enough to see where she's going. She walks through the living room past the bookshelf without stopping. The books are still there. The stories remain. None of them disappear when she stops looking at them. Grace enters the bedroom. She changes clothes, folds them neatly, and sets them on the chair. No extra arranging, no fine adjustments. She pulls back the covers and lies down. The bed supports her body just as the porch swing did earlier, asking nothing of her. She places one hand on her stomach, one on her chest. Not to do anything, just to feel her breath move in and out. With each exhale, her fingers soften. They no longer hold the shape of a grip. A few thoughts drift through her mind. About tomorrow, about the years behind her. But they don't stay long. They arrive like sand touching her palm and fall away when her hand remains open. If you're listening to this and recognize how tightly you've been holding on for a long time, that's okay. You did it to protect yourself, to keep things from breaking apart. But tonight you can try another way. You don't need to hold everything. You don't need to prove you're still in control. You only need to open your hand and let what wants to stay in its own way. Sleep doesn't come when we grip it. Sleep arrives when we stop holding on. Grace closes her eyes, not because she decides to sleep, but because there's no longer a reason to keep them open. Her hands remain open, light still, and if you fall asleep at some point while listening, that's perfectly natural. If you're still awake, you're still resting in a very safe place. No gripping, no holding, just letting everything fall and allowing yourself to rest. The stories are done. The lessons are learned. There is nothing left to do. If you found peace in this sanctuary tonight, you can return here whenever you wish. We will keep the fire lit for you. If you wish to support this channel, you may leave a gentle like or subscribe so we can find each other again in the vast ocean of the internet. But now, as we move into the final space of rest, let's plant seeds of peace deep into your subconscious. Let go, drift, and let these truths become your own. My thoughts are settling like sediment in a glass of still water. Go of all ripples. The surface of my mind is becoming glass. Like a river flows to the ocean, my worries flow away from me. Obstacles without resistance. The waters of sleep are washing over my tired eyes. Floating in a sea of tranquility, weightless and free. Breath is like the tide, flowing in and flowing out. Deep below the surface waves, my inner ocean is silent. I release the day just as a leaf drifts down a stream. Cool, healing water soothes my nervous system. Merging into the velvet depths of rest. There is no need to swim. I simply float. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. clear, transparent, and still. I am clear, transparent, and still. Transparent and still. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. I sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. I sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. Water fills a cup. Water fills a cup. Fills me like water fills a cup.